Welcome to the Against Unreason Podcast. Today, I'm talking with a friend about several topics.
Lessons we teach Occupy Wall Street logic idiots.
Yeah, absolutely. Silly, stupid things that Occupy Wall Street logic and any page related to them, including Unbiased America or Will Ricciardella in particular.
Kevin Ryan, Will Ricciardella, Greg Kurtner. I'm sure there's another guy saying that's speaking right
now. Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard the name Greg Kurtner before.
Greg Kurtner, the main ODL guy. He's the one who's always joking about being Pinochet. He's really proud of saying, women shouldn't vote or communists aren't people, that kind of stuff.
Oh, okay. I don't know if it's Facebook's algorithm or whatnot. I do follow ODL, but it doesn't pop up as much as Unbiased America, and so basically Kevin Ryan's name is the one who I'm always seeing on irritating posts that are stupidly simplistic and obviously more of a polemic trying to push a point irrespective of the evidence rather than vice versa.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
So anyway, I think the last conversation that I saw was you and a guy. What was he talking about? Marx or Adam Smith or?
Yeah. I don't think people. Okay, well, I'll just explain that to you. So the post on ODL was something to the effect of Marx believes that labor theory of value says that a product is valued by how much labor you put in, and that's obviously false because you could make mud pies and that's worth nothing. That's the simplest way people put it.
Right.
It's a complete straw man. I'll pause myself. Do you understand why that's a straw man, or have you heard that before?
Well, I saw your explanation that basically multiple things go into what something is worth, but in any case, I think your argument was regardless of where something gets its value, when it is valued by the public, it is simply that, what was it, Adam Smith that you were talking about, says there's a certain amount of that value that you're entitled to as the person who made it?
Yeah, pretty much. Okay, so I'll just start from the bottom and explain it all. So there are two, not necessarily competing, but two perspectives of how we value things. The one we're most familiar with today is what Austrians and maybe even classical economics call subjective or supply and demand, which is nothing's worth anything other than what you're willing to pay for it.
Right.
And that it makes sense for the most part. The only problem with it, at least in practice, is that it ignores the bargaining power, purchasing power, or just power dynamics in general of what a person has to supply and demand, which is kind of like saying, just to give you a most extreme example, back in the day when slavery was legal, the value of labor is effectively free because there is no legal way for a slave to sell his labor. The slave has no legal right to bargain. The slave has no legal right, or at least not practical legal right, to defend himself in the event he's abused, at least by modern standards. So the supply and demand is, for lack of a better word, dictated by the local laws or culture of what you are allowed to supply and demand.
Right.
And I'll give you another example. Fast forward today, housing. Under supply and demand, we predict that with more houses than homeless people, a builder or a landlord should do his or her best to sell or rent out the house because having anything is better than nothing, right?
Right.
That might be a oversimplification, but the point is, game theory and supply and demand predict that a person sitting on a house or a land that's unused is wasteful because it's useless unless you extract value from it. That's the simplest explanation, but this ignores, and everybody knows this, regardless of where you stand, that's not what actually happens. They sit on it because they speculate that by holding on to something that's already scarce, they could make it more valuable, more scarce, and decrease the supply, therefore relatively increase the demand, therefore profit. So game theory predicts that a person should get anything because anything is better than nothing.
Right.
But you look at the bigger picture of reality, and that tells you that If you have more information or more power, such as you could afford to wait, you're not starving as a landlord, then you could sit on your property and wait till the highest bidder comes along. And or throw in another factor, maintenance costs. Or ironically enough, why aren't houses free if nobody wants it? Because labor. Even if nobody wants a house, everybody knows that it still takes labor and material to build it. So nobody would ever give out a house for free.
Right.
Yeah. So that's just two very obvious examples of why supply and demand is great on a very simplistic or maybe macro level, but doesn't explain the nuances of human behavior.
Right.
So go ahead.
So would another example be if a business was competing with another business that was somewhat smaller and it lowered the price of its product or service below the point of actually breaking even. So it was operating at a loss, but because it's bigger, it can operate at a loss long enough to put the opponent out of business. And so in that case, again, the simple rules of supply and demand are not dictating the price that that business is charging for its service or product.
Kind of, yeah. Or you could argue that the laws still apply, but you need to have the right amount of information to accurately assess the outcome.
Right.
So it's not that supply and demand are wrong. It's that supply and demand are just one of many factors you have to consider.
Right, absolutely.
And I'll that's actually, another good example. Stefan Molyneux was famous for making a video about 10 or 12 years ago called, the myths or the fallacies that people make for free market capitalism. One of the arguments he had in there was that in a free market, we would have monopolies, or in a free market, a company would do just like you said, which is they will ask us to kill the competition. And Stefan argued at the time, which is that's unsustainable. Nobody would do that. That's stupid. That's not profitable. Why would anybody do that? He was either naive or dishonest to not know that some companies literally can afford to. And some companies understand that short-term losses in exchange for market share is worth it. And another common straw man argument is that monopoly is impossible because nobody could actually literally own 100%. But they ignore that even if you had 70 or 80% or even 50% in some cases, that is so big that nobody else comes close. Right. And that may be a technical non-monopoly, but practically you do have so much power that it would be impractical for somebody to compete against you. So back to Stefan. He did not see, or if he did, he's dishonest, that Amazon was doing exactly that. Amazon to this day, correct me if I'm wrong, their retail side of the business is still losing money. And currently, they account for somewhere close to half or more of all US e-commerce transactions. It is so synonymous with online shopping that people almost don't think about it. When they say online shopping, people almost instinctively know what you're talking about.
Right. And actually, I'm not 100, I'm not as familiar on that specific topic, but I do know of other anti-business practices that Amazon's been caught doing. For example, they seem to be...
Competition, not anti-business.
Yeah, anti-competition. They seem to be, they'll invest supposedly in a new business, a startup business venture, and they'll basically get enough control of it to where they learn significant amounts of the trade secrets of that service, and they will basically, in a few months or a year or whatever, put out their own competition and virtually put those businesses out of business.
Yep.
Basically illegal corporate espionage.
I'm not sure I'm sure they did it. Yeah, I'm sure if they did it legally. So it might not really be trade secret if they were allowed to, learn it or transfer in some legal way. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me that businesses are doing that. If they did have non-disclosure, it would. I'm not a business lawyer, but I would assume that if something was material, meaning information, regardless of its form, was materially beneficial or materially relevant, then it doesn't matter how you learn it or copy it. If you stole it, you stole it. That's
right.
That's the
well, and
Go ahead.
I can't remember the specific example. It was something I read in the Wall Street Journal about 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago or something like that.
Okay,
I think multiple companies had filed a lawsuit or something to that effect, or just, gone to the press and talked about how Amazon invested in their business, and then after they found out enough about the product that they had, Amazon would put out a competitor after hardly any time, and it essentially, if not immediately put it out of business, put it at serious threat of going out of business.
Yeah. So now back to Molyneux. So Amazon did exactly that, which is they go out of their way to make things as cheap as possible, even to lose money, because they know that it's far more valuable to keep you as a customer. You are more valuable as a name and contact than what you buy.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what Amazon invested. Now, you could argue that this is obviously an investment. They're still making a rational choice. They still are winning at the end. That's kind of the point, which is Molyneux literally said this. He says, no board of directors would allow somebody to go at a loss just to get market share. He's totally wrong. This is exactly what people do.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm not 100% sure if this case is one of them, but I think Amazon Fires, I don't even know if they charge enough to break even with the physical equipment itself, but because there's so much of the package that ties in with the rest of Amazon's service that it ends up still making tons of money despite perhaps the product itself, in this case the Amazon or the Kindle Fire, isn't itself being profitable.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I've seen videos of people making not making gadgets, reviewing gadgets, and yes, some I do believe I've seen somebody say, I don't know if it's true, but I've seen somebody say that the Fire device, or at least some of them, are intended to be losses, meaning if you buy it and do nothing with Amazon, you fucked them over.
Right. Exactly.
They are willing to lose money to send it to you, because that is your pipeline to buy more stuff, kind of like a feeding tube.
Yeah.
So the same is true. Here's another example. We can completely step out of Amazon. Ink printers. We know that inkjet printers are sold at a loss in exchange for you buying their ink forever.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is why so many people complain about why don't I just buy a new printer, because that's almost as cheap as getting some ink or something like that. Or if the printer is only a year old, then you may as well get a new printer because of how expensive the ink is, or something to that effect.
Yes, exactly. And that joke has been true for 20 years. It's not even funny.
Same thing with like the smelly good things that you plug into your wall. Like you can buy the actual diffuser and it comes with 2 scent things. And then when you go back to buy a pack of the scented refills, they're almost as expensive as just buying a brand new diffuser.
Exactly. And so in that light, let's really segue into, this is one of the things that I always challenge libertarians on, because libertarians would always tell us, hey, in a free market, somebody would just compete and make a better product. Okay, so today, tell me, where is that better printer? Who is this benevolent printer maker that is not ripping you off? I'm not aware of it. I mean, maybe it exists.
I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah. There are ink refillers, yes. And I've read that the main reason inkjet printers keep updating their firmware is to prevent them. But the point is, yes, making ink refills is easy, but until you own the printer, it's limited in how much damage you can do. And to this day, I'm sorry, there is no competitor to the 5 or 10 major printer companies. Or if there is, they're not priced in a way that makes sense to an average consumer. We've accepted that. I mean, it's the reason they get away with it is because, all things considered, despite our drop in per product or per person demand, but it might increase demand based on aggregation or economic growth and all that. But based on what at least theoretically should be a decrease in demand, it's, put it this way, printing costs are still a very small cost in our everyday life. That's how they get away with it. So every time somebody says, a Starbucks a day, yeah, $5 a day adds up to a lot in a lifetime, but $5 a day is still a small fraction of your money if you make 100 or 200 a day. And that's why they get away.
Yeah.
So the point of this is that the free market claim that competition will always bring lower prices, better products, prevent monopolies is just wrong. And it doesn't account for lots of human behaviors. It's helpful in predicting a good portion of it. I will concede that. But it doesn't admit some very obvious facts. And so we go back a little bit to the original post about Marx. What is labor theory of value? I'll try to explain it as simple as possible. Labor theory of value says that kind of like subjective theory, or kind of like our normal perspective of pricing, looking at things through the lens of pricing. I think that's probably the easiest way. If you think of subjective pricing or libertarian Austrian economics, they view things completely in terms of dollars, meaning I give you $3 for a coffee, you give me $5 for a brick, so-and-so, $5 represents what you're willing to pay, how much labor you believe it costs to make a brick, yada, yada, yada. So we believe that at any point when a transaction happens, two people exchange hands of what they believe is mostly a fair trade. But of course, in reality, obviously, you pay $5 for a brick because you value a brick more than $5 and vice versa. That aside, that's looking at things through the lens of dollars and pricing. Labor theory basically says we will look at things through the lens of workers and labor, because all things are made by labor. Yes, even things that are automated. So,
right, at least indirectly.
Yeah. So labor theory simply says that if and when two things are exchanged, then at least in theory, you can reasonably expect that when two things of equal value are exchanged, whether it's a rose for a cup of coffee or a glass of wine for a lemon, they are somewhat of equal value in labor,
right?
Which is kind of a very simplest way of saying labor is money. Or you could see things through the lens of labor just as much as you could see things through the lens of dollars. That's really what it is.
Right, you can come at it from either perspective.
Exactly.
You can say everything boils down to this just as easily as you could say, oh wait, no, it all boils down to this. It's technically they're both right because it entirely depends on the paradigm you're looking at it from.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because a capitalist will tell you all day that you can't make money unless you put in labor, but they know damn well, in the next breath, wait 5 seconds, they'll tell you, oh no, you can make money by just being a landlord or earning interest or creating a service.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or just putting some cash in the stock market and leaving it there for long enough. The labor of opening up your stockbroker account on the internet, placing your money in it, that labor isn't proportional to the money that you would make off of it. The amount of money that you make off of it isn't entirely proportional to the amount of money that you put into it and you had at your disposal in the first place.
Yeah. And so labor theory would say that when you invest $10 into the stock market and make another $10, double your money, it's not that you didn't put in labor. It's that somebody values whatever you own at twice as what you bought, which means they still believe that to some implied extent, without being too insane, yes, they still believe that paying you $20 for the stock you bought 10 is worth whatever labor they need to put to earn it. And I dare any libertarian to tell me they disagree.
Right.
Because what else does, this is how they justify anything. If they're going to tell you that taxation is theft, or you deserve every dollar you earn, or billionaires and millionaires work very hard for their money and they justly earned every cent, they have to believe that what they earn is justly earned and they are not going to give it away for less than market value. And market value is basically what a person is willing to labor to get it.
Right.
Yeah. So again, I'll just try to wrap up the labor theory thing, which is, like you said, labor theory says that regardless of what a piece of mud pie or a computer is worth, if and when that transaction does occur, the least replaceable and most essential component of the production process is labor. Therefore, the laborer is entitled to all, or at least most, of the price of the product. If you sell a computer for $1,000, every person who labored for it is entitled to split up that $1,000. There shouldn't be any middlemen for it. There's material costs and there's labor costs, and that's it. So a capitalist would counter this and say, well, what about I risked my investment. I provided the factory. And so you have to ask, what allowed you to have this upper hand or advantage over a worker that entitles you to take a portion of this earning. So in Marx's view, if a person works at a factory and makes a t-shirt or a computer, and when that computer is sold, a worker is entitled to that full value because he is the least replaceable and most essential part of the process. So if a computer sells for $1,000, a laborer is entitled to all $1,000 minus material costs. A capitalist would argue that because a boss provided the factory, he's entitled to a portion of it. Otherwise, why would I employ a worker if I'm not going to make a profit? So what is their justification for making a profit off of a worker?
I mean, in this case, I would agree that if the businessman provided, say, tools, place, and all that sort of thing, that he's entitled to the amount of value that contributed to the product. I'm not sure exactly what a libertarian would say, but
okay. That's very close to what most people would say. That's fair. Now, that's not untrue. I mean, even in the most extreme case, regardless of what you like it, it's logically understandable. But you have to ask, what created the situation where one person can provide a factory and a person could not?
Right. Well, in a lot of cases, it's just luck, which is an underestimated whole component of the whole system. Say, whether you're born into money or whether you just happened upon a product that at that moment in time was gaining steam through just the whole system and not necessarily your ingenuity and whatnot. You may have just accidentally made all that money, and so therefore you have a foothold. It was an accident.
Yeah. So this is when I talk to people, what I normally call this is unfair advantage. Regardless of how you have the means to build a factory, the fact that you have a factory does give you an unfair advantage to somebody who does not. So The next question is this: whether you advocate for socialism or universal basic income or some form of increased opportunity for everybody, this is a question that I think I've stumped everybody on, and they don't like hearing it because they really don't have a good answer, which is, what advantage would you have if every person was allowed to use the land they see that's not used, or the factory that you're owning was not protected by the state? What advantage would you have if everybody had as much money as you?
Right. You'd have, well, actually, again, I would say that random chance, because no matter what, there's a certain amount of randomness in the system.
Of course.
And so even if you started everyone else equally one day, whether it's obviously some people are going to work harder than others, and some people are going to have more knowledge about whatever they're doing than others, but there's a massive amount of randomness in the whole system that many of the people that are working their fingers to the bone are still not going to excel, and many of the people that are kind of just getting by are actually going to, by luck and chance, get ahead of the game. And the more money that you have and the more influence you have, the more ability you have to get more.
Exactly. So in more simplistic terms, the point of my question or my answer is, you would have very little advantage, or the only advantage you would have left is if you work harder.
Right.
So yes, some people are stronger. Some people are have more work ethic. Some people are smarter. Some people do have better health, and some people do have the unfair biological ability to earn more by the moment they are born. But that is far different than economic advantage. And this is another very dishonest point that libertarians don't like to admit. They like to conflate economic property with biology. So when you say, somebody has unfair advantage, they say, oh, so are you saying tall people need to be forced to be short? Are you saying tall people can't play basketball? No. We're saying nobody should be born with money they didn't earn. Nobody should have capital that they didn't labor for. If you take away these advantages, you will quickly dismantle every advantage that a rich person with a kid has. That rich kid, today's rich kid, would have to work just as hard as, or at least much harder than he does today, than a poor kid with none of these advantages. If you allowed one man, one vote, it doesn't matter how rich you are, you still have one vote. Similarly, if you didn't allow people to buy their way into better schools, then everybody would have to be in a equally good or equally bad school. If you don't allow people to bribe teachers or bribe policemen, then everybody would be at the same advantage or disadvantage regardless of how much money they have. This is what equalizing opportunity is. It's taking away people's ability to use money, especially money they didn't earn, to buy advantages that other people don't have.
Right.
Yeah.
So let me double check that I know what you're saying. You're simply saying that if everyone was equalized, that things would basically end up like that. Are you specifically suggesting that that is a policy that we enact, is equalizing everyone at birth?
I believe we should equalize economic opportunities at birth, yes.
So what would that entail?
That would entail getting rid of inheritance. That would entail limiting how much property you can own. That would entail not allowing people to sit on property they're not utilizing. That would entail some form of limiting ownership of a publicly traded company. It's many various ways of limiting how rich a person can get, unless and until the poorest person isn't being unnecessarily, suffering. To put it more simply, I don't care how rich. This is contrary to what a lot of people think. I do not care how rich the rich people are. I care how poor the poorest people are. So if you feed every person and nobody has to get up and make another person richer in exchange for food, I don't care if the richest person is a trillionaire. I don't care
Jeff
if he has
Bezos?
10 generations that never have to work, as long as nobody else does either.
Right. So I agree and disagree with all of those things to various degrees. The first one that I think you mentioned was that you shouldn't be able to inherit wealth. And my thing is, I don't see how that could easily be implemented in a non-authoritarian way.
Okay, I accept that. So your question is basically, how can you seize property without using force? And my answer to that is, all property is force. We simply accept some more than others.
Right. So elaborate on that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Gladly. So think of it this way: today, what empowers a landlord to charge a tenant whatever amount he asks for? The libertarian will tell you, supply and demand. But no. Take a little step further. What allows this landlord to have the control of the supply?
Well, there's a couple. Depending on how much, first off, competition, like is there any other landlords that are also offering a different price for better value? But then there's also how many other landlords are there around? Is this landlord the only person? And then he can pretty much arbitrarily charge as much as he wants.
Yes. But even more simply, what makes a landlord a landlord?
Ownership of the land.
What makes ownership of the land?
Having invested money into the land enough to buy it legally,
or more simply, you bought it from somebody, right?
Right.
If I asked you what makes ownership of a slave, what's your answer? You bought him, right?
In a system in which you could buy him, that would be the
exactly. So you own a land because you're allowed to legally buy it. You own a slave because you're allowed to legally buy it. You own a car because you're allowed to legally buy it. All ownership comes down to what the government allows you to buy and own.
Right. But of course, in the case of a slave, it is at the direct expense of the ethical livelihood of another
obviously
sentient being.
Okay, so that's exactly why I'm making this point. We've accepted that owning land is not a violation of other people's rights. But we used to say the same thing about slavery. We used to believe that owning a slave is not a violation of a slave's rights. We now know that's not true. Today, we can.
Well, that's because back then they didn't think slaves had rights.
And today we don't believe humans have rights to land and housing. We only recognize land and housing to people who can afford it. That's the same idea.
Right. So I'm hearing that. I'd also point out that it was actually a book that I was reading, the How Nations Fall. I can't remember the name of it right off the top of my head. But anyway, or Why Nations Fail. That was the name of the book. And basically it was talking about how it was giving examples. And one of them was a town that is split by the southern border.
Mm-hmm.
Same name and everything. But on the American side, it is much more prosperous, and on the Mexican side it is less prosperous. And the author was pointing out that it's because the institutions that protect the property on the southern side, as in someone's not going to invest in building a business and selling a product if it could just be taken away from them the next day. So to some degree, that whether or not it is ultimately right or moral to own land, it seems that it nonetheless is required in order for someone to feel confident enough that their business isn't going to be taken over, destroyed,
I completely agree with you.
Something to that
Yes, and
degree. So
yeah, okay, I completely agree with you. Yeah, everything you said is right. Without a security that you, or assurance that you can keep what you work for, you have little incentive to work for it, right?
Right.
So this is the same argument for without assurance that I could exploit the book I write or the movie I make, then why would I invest money or in some cases borrow money to make a movie, right?
Right.
Okay, and the same case was if I didn't have an incentive to keep my slave for the labor that I wish to extract from it, I wouldn't buy one, right?
Say that again.
If it wasn't legal for me to buy a slave, I wouldn't buy one, right? At least if I was a rational person.
Right.
Okay, so
but
go ahead.
But you don't have to have a slave to make money, but you do have to have a stable workplace or a stable business or something like that in order to make money.
Okay, and that's a good point, and I will tell you why that is still immaterial. So you could argue, I don't know how you could argue otherwise, it is a fact that today the slave market in all the states where it's illegal is not prosperous. It's not profitable. There are no slaves on the market. There are no buyers or sellers on the market, at least virtually none, right? Mm-hmm. And an economy and a person who expects to buy or sell slaves in a world where slavery is illegal is not going to be very, very successful, right?
Right.
Okay. So back to the example of U.S. versus Mexico. What you're seeing is superficially, you have more businesses and more houses and cleaner houses and more well-kept streets on a side where property is protected because that's the society that values property, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. What you're not seeing or probably not considering, and this is very normal. People don't think of it because sometimes these tools or technology isn't available. When you say property can or isn't protected, people often forget that there are varying kinds of property. There is land, there is the computer you use, there's the toothbrush you use, then there is your bank account. Yes, I wouldn't put money in my bank account if I knew I was going to lose it tomorrow. But if you told me that I could lose my house but not my bank account, where do you think I'm going to put my money?
It depends how much is in your bank account.
But my point is, if I had a choice to put money in my bank account and my house, and I was told that one is more stable than the other, I would put it in the more stable one, right?
Right.
Okay. So what you're seeing is that when people say property, they don't really make the distinction between business use and personal use. That's number one. Two, what I would argue is an also very important distinction is based on marginal utility, a rich person's property versus the poor person's property. So it's not so much that I don't want to protect, I want to stop protecting all property. I believe that at some point a person can't be allowed to own more. So whether that's $1 million worth of property or $100 million worth of property, you got to cap it at somewhere.
Right. So I would be of the position that I agree that there should be things put into place. Obviously, I'm in favor of Andrew Yang's freedom dividend, a UBI, to make it so that the fact that random chance is so much of a reason why some people excel and why some fall back, that a certain amount of money should be given to everyone, and in order to not let other people fall through the cracks. But crap, I lost my train of thought. Sorry, what was that? What were we
I was
talking about right before I went into that?
You got to stop protecting rich people's property. At some point, rich people can't keep owning.
Right. Okay. So what I was going to say is, again, I think rich people should be taxed for a UBI, but I'm not sure. Again, a lot of what you're saying, I'm not necessarily against so much in theory as I am in practice.
Yeah, I totally
that. Like I said, a lot of accomplishing a lot of those things seems like it would require an awful lot of authoritarianism, and authoritarianism to accomplish things that are, philosophically honorable, desirable things.
I completely agree with you. Yeah, I will totally admit that, which is, yes, some things sound great in theory, even sound moral, but getting there may require violating morals or violating laws that we've accepted, right?
Well, not even just that. Who's going to be implementing it? People. Who's going to be choosing these people? Other people. And so just look, and I hate to sound too much like a right libertarian, but because they always make this reference too, but going back to the Soviet Union, Russia, they were, especially at the beginning, they tried to implement these things. They legalized abortion, they legalized universal suffrage, they did all this other stuff, but as it went on, in order to enforce these things, just the whole people went corrupt, the bureaucracy went bad, it just didn't work out that well. And so it seems to me like we still haven't gotten to the point where we could prevent that sort of thing from happening if we tried to implement such a huge change.
Oh, I totally agree. I would even concede that the reason we got here in the first place is because we are corrupt people. But to the point of which, you can't get there without being authoritarian, or you can't get there by violating the laws that we're used to. Again, I have to remind you, what do you think we are now? Right now, we're still authoritarian. We still are very disrespectful of people's rights. We simply are changing the people we violate. Now, you are right to be skeptical and say, well, why should I trust that when you're violating the people I don't care about, you're not going to bite back, or you're not going to become corrupt, or we're not going to become like all those failed socialist countries where people with allegedly good intentions gone bad, right?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, that's a fair question. But the best response I can give is, but you have to understand that the alternative we have now is continuing to favoring already the most powerful people. I don't know how to say this without being overly romanticizing, but yes, we do have to give people who traditionally do not have power a chance to, for lack of a better word, abuse it.
Yeah, that's probably where I would take a hard. I'm not.
You're not. So
I don't know if you've caught the theme of some of the stuff that I've said on the internet, but I am very much not in favor of mob rule or absolute utter unbridled tyranny of the majority. Not that I'm saying I support an arbitrary aristocracy, or that I don't think that the wealthy and powerful absolutely owe it to society to send the elevator back down. So, don't get me wrong, but I don't have a huge amount of faith in the masses either.
I totally understand that. I totally understand that. And this is not to disagree with you, but I do believe that, times have changed. Maybe not substantially, maybe not enough as the way I like it, but I do believe that in the past time, I'll remind me to come back to the analogy of capitalism, but in a past time, 200 or 300 years ago, the fear of mob rule was mostly for two reasons. You fear people who don't have money, which means they have little to lose. You fear people who don't have education, which means they are not informed to make the best decisions of who to hurt or help. Those are the main justifications, at least two that I can think of, for why we fear mob rule. You may disagree.
Well, that may have been why they feared mob rule back then. There's actually plenty of
new reasons,
plenty of modern reasons against mob rule. For example, the book "The Death of Expertise" by Tom Nichols, it goes through multiple modern examples of things that have gone awry because of mass action, or because of probably the easiest, most simple example that I can say is, okay, so people complain about the mainstream news, air quotes, mainstream news, sensationalizing things. They complain about it being overly biased, or with the History Channel or the Discovery Channel. They complain, they complain about these things having corrupted. but the very same people complaining about these things going crappy are the same people who refuse to watch those shows or cable news or whatever unless they are crappy. They are the same people who've driven it that direction, and yet they're
more blunt than that.
The same ones complaining about.
Okay, dude, you could be more blunt than that, which is just to give you throw in the data. Alex Jones and his conspiracy theorists are complaining that the media is lying to you, but they're lying even worse, right?
Right.
That's basically what you're getting at. You got me. I think that's a very good example. But the
one thing before I move along, I was also going to mention another example because I mentioned the Tom Nichols example, and so one of the quotes from a recent book that I read mentioned him saying, "When I gave talks around the country, people would say, 'We have to do something because Washington doesn't listen to us.' And then he would say, 'I really get mad and say, Washington listens to you too much. It gives you too much of what you're asking for, and the problem is what you're asking for is internally contradictory and changes every few years. Do you want a national healthcare system or expanded Medicare? Your answer, we want both. No one in Washington says you can't have that. They say, yes, sir, we'll go and do it.' And so that's my thing, and it's true. Every 4 years, every 8 years, whatever it is, it swings from Democrat to Republican, and people act as if, these complete paradigm shifts every few years before any one of the approaches has a chance to work. They just pull the rug out from under it.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. And so back to how we were came down the road of why I sound like I'm advocating for mob rule, which is you said how can you implement something to the effect of wealth confiscation or wealth redistribution without being authoritarian, right?
Right.
Yeah, okay. My answer to that probably would be better if I put it this way, which is look at our values. What do we value today? In a mostly capitalist society, we have come to accept that money is more valuable than human life. We've come to conflate that a person having money is synonymous or at least equally honorable as somebody who's born with a smart brain or a healthy body or a work ethic. We seem to think this is probably a byproduct of being so subjective about value that we think anything that happens to produce value is valuable. So in that light, think of it this way. This is not lesser of two evils, but really, we are being, your fear right now is we are being authoritarian, but that is still better than being authoritarian about human life and health and basic needs. So yes, it is authoritarian or disrespectful of property to take from the rich. If you believe that ownership is always just and absolute, then yeah, all theft is wrong, which I argue that we got to be a little more subtle. Some theft is more acceptable than others. Some taking by force is more acceptable than others. It's not popular. People don't like to hear it, but it's true. Some people need money more than other people. We could argue all day or who decides what's just, what's fair, who to take it, how much to take. But at the end of the day, we already decided that. We seem to mostly have accepted for decades that the system we have today is mostly fair. Nobody is, yes, a lot of people are complaining, but nobody in power is complaining that the rich have too much money and they're not even using it. It's not even that, they're necessarily using it to their advantage. They're literally sitting on it. They couldn't spend it if they wanted to. Well,
I mean, depends what you're talking about, because most of Warren Buffett's money, most of Jeff Bezos' money is in the stock market and is floating around the system and going through the...
Yeah, it's making more,
everything
but he can't even spend what he has. So yes, it's making more, but the more he makes, the harder it is for him to spend it, even if he wanted to. That's kind of what I mean.
Right. So a minute ago, what you mentioned was that people value money and whatnot more than the actual backbreaking labor of the people who are doing it. And to some degree, this is true, but I would also point out that this is less the case than it ever has been in human history, particularly in developed countries. And so I'm a bit due to the fact that things have in fact been getting better, despite the fact that there absolutely are many terrible things that still exist and many things that need to change and be fixed and improved upon, but things are also pretty close to better than they've been for the 99.99% that the human species has existed, and certainly things are much better than they've been any time in the last 2,000 years, 100 years.
Yes, I agree.
It's just things are drastically improved, and so and again, it's in a lot of what I'm issue is with what you're saying is in practice, because I'm not convinced that in their attempts to implement these changes that you want to change, that things aren't going to fall down and end up with a net negative to where people are no more treated like, or just as much treated like trash or unvalued in that system in practice as it is right now. Basically, my claim is that the maturity of society is not to the degree to which that will work. To me, it's the equivalent of trying to force Iraq into invade Iraq and force it to be a country like America when the people there were not ready for that.
Oh yeah.
They're not used to that. People are stuck in tradition in America, but particularly in countries like that. And that's happened multiple times throughout history, where you try to drag someone kicking and screaming into what, if properly implemented, would be a better system. But the fact that the people aren't ready for it, and the people that are trying to implement it are also part of that system and are imperfect, ends up being just as bad, if not worse, than before. So my thing is I would aspire to the same sort of system that you are. I just don't know about forcing it on people rather than allowing society to evolve and change naturally. Because if it is the better system, then that should be how it evolves.
Okay, I mostly agree with you, but I think I have an answer to what you were asking. How do we get there? I think we can get there by appealing to some very obvious things that most people could possibly agree on, which is, number one, everybody deserves health care. Or number two, right, everybody deserves a basic income. I don't think that's far enough, right, but I think that's a good start. Number three, which a lot of people don't like talking about, not very popular, but I think would go a long way, is taxing vacancy.
Right. Well, I, of course, agree with you 100% on the first two. I'm not completely familiar with what you mean by that third point, though.
Oh, you want me to explain?
Yeah.
Yeah. Vacancy tax is basically if you have housing intended for renting, then it's taxed when it's not rented.
Interesting idea. I don't have enough knowledge on this topic to say whether I would agree with it or not, but it'd be something interesting to look into.
Yeah. So from what I understand,
make your argument for it.
I haven't fully fact checked this, but I do have people that work in real estate and property management. They did say that in some states they're already doing it. Los Angeles is considering doing it. Probably won't happen anytime soon, but it's an idea. The point is that when you have, this is the thing, we keep saying there's housing shortage, but there isn't. It's affordability shortage. There are still more empty houses than there are homeless people. Even in Los Angeles, even in the worst homeless populations, there are still more empty houses than there are homeless people, especially when you account for hotel rooms and duplexes and commercial office use, that kind of stuff.
Right.
That absolutely makes it true. But even residential, you might still be true. The point of this is that you have this situation because you're allowed to. So states have tried to address not vacancy. They don't call the problem vacancy. They call the problem affordability. So if you only think of affordability as a symptom, you address a symptom and then you don't address the underlying issue. So states try to do things like rent control, which sounds great in theory, which means, if you're renting, you're grandfathered in, and therefore you wouldn't be forced out every year just because it keeps rising up. But what it practically means is that people have a very little incentive to move, because as soon as they move, they lose that grandfathered in low price. The landlord could jack it up, and then the landlord, knowing that he could jack it up, will jack it up all the way to compensate for the past losses and so on. So it's a very bad policy to address the problem of affordability. But if you taxed vacancy, what you're really saying is either you put it on the market and you rent it out as soon as possible, or don't. And if you don't, then you'll just be sitting on property for nothing. Good for you. If you want to sit on your empty house and never extract value from it, good for you. Nothing we can do to that. But if you intend to, you put it on the market, you list it, you make plans to extract profit from your rental property, which most likely you will. That's the whole point of buying it. Then you will be taxed if it's not actually rented out. That means it'll, at least in theory, encourage you to rent it out as soon as possible, even if it's at some loss. It would not allow you to say that I can ultimately jack it up and then compensate for all the months that I didn't rent it out.
Right. So what about, this is certainly not a problem I have, but what if you have a second home and you don't intend on it being a rental property, period? It is just a different place that you live at different times.
Then it wouldn't apply.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nuances, but the short answer is this only applies if you did things to make it commercially and legally available to rent. If you don't,
right. So basically, you need to classify it with the government as something that you intend on renting out, and if it is in that classification, then you get taxed if you don't do it.
Exactly, and this kind of goes back to the question of, or the issue of, there are many rentals that are technically illegal, meaning they were not prepared up to code. They're people's houses that they only rent a portion of it to. Yes, it would. The trade-off would be that yes, we would make a very clear distinction between what is intended for rent and what is not intended for rent. So the only people getting away with it would be the people that aren't commercializing it. And I don't think that's a problem because of a simple question of scale. A person who has one or two of his or her own houses sitting around that they may or may not want to Airbnb occasionally or have a friend house sit, they're not the problem. The problem is people who own multi-unit apartments, people who buy up whole houses with the sole intention of investment. Those are the problem.
Right.
So it's, vacancy tax, if you had to make a distinction for who's applicable, yes, it will not be perfect, but it hits the problem, at least an appreciable portion of it, where it really hurts.
Right. Okay. Have you ever looked into the YIMBY neoliberal platform? Yes in my backyard neoliberal. It's basically seems primarily worried about making cities better and more livable and all this other sort of stuff. I mean, just let me read off a couple things. Their values are: we want our cities to be dense. Not everyone has to live in a city, but we must allow dense urban spaces for those who want to. Dense cities are livable. They allow for walkability and mass transit, reducing community times and cost. They expose us to a diverse range of people, ideas, and experiences. They allow niche businesses and interests to thrive. Dense cities multiply productivity, companies benefit, yada, yada, yada. And so that has to do with the density. Then there's diversity. The most interesting, vibrant, creative communities welcome all kinds of people, including all races, genders, ages, abilities, and sexual orientations, and integrate them throughout the city. All professions must be able to live and thrive throughout the city. Teachers, nurses, artists, firefighters, plumbers, engineers, writers, managers, and many others are part of a complete community. Cities must be open to newcomers while supporting longtime residents. And then dynamic. The best cities are dynamic organisms, always evolving. They respect the past while actively creating the future. Today's cities are the result of past development, and continued prosperity requires constant reinvention. We must allow for experimentation and embrace the uncertainty that comes with innovation. Equitable cities must ensure equitable opportunity, support representation, and getting to more of the core of their beliefs, they say, we believe the best way to realize these values is by pairing well-functioning markets with effective government, and we reject simplistic philosophies that lionize one and villainize the other. In particular, solving our housing crisis requires a housing market. More responsive to the demand, as well as a government refocused on public investment and social protections. And so anyway, long story short, that's only a part of the thing, but they seem like an organization that is very pragmatic, and your proposals about potentially taxing vacancy and whatnot kind of reminds me of their pragmatic approach to trying to improve cities.
Yeah, so I'll be totally honest. The first three lines that you read kind of sound like, yeah, but what or how? Because it sounds like we want to welcome everybody. Well, how do you welcome everybody other than just welcoming everybody?
Yeah. Well, I somewhat skipped across them because I didn't want it to be too long. But like for the first one, the dense thing, it says dense cities are an environmental necessity. They allow us to preserve open spaces rather than sprawl into them. Our densest cities must emit 70% less carbon per capita than the national average. Restricting urban density exacerbates climate change. Yeah. Again, they're not these. The beginning of the thing doesn't mention exactly how they would accomplish it. That's kind of more down the thing.
A little bit, because I think the one thing I took away from that is they believe that policies are good because policies are good, not policies are good because it demonizes a specific people.
Absolutely. It should be about the consequences, not your mythologized idea of the perfect society, which of course for the right wing, for Republicans, would be a society where gay peoples either didn't exist, or they were put in prison, or they repressed themselves so much that they pretended to be straight. There would be no abortion. Women having children out of wedlock would be scorned, all sort of stuff. So that there's a lot that would be encompassed in the right-wing dream of society. It has nothing to do with the actual feasibility or consequences of trying to put something like that into trying to implement that, or even whether something implementing that is an objectively good or something that you should even want. Whereas, again, there's plenty of crazy people on the left that I absolutely am fully against. But in general, it's about results. It's not about, I think actually an example that I used in the last podcast was the right-wing love of abstinence-only sex education. They don't care that abstinence-only sex education objectively leads to more STD spread and more teen pregnancy. They want to implement it regardless because they, rather than being concerned with the actual consequences, they're concerned with their moral dogmas.
Or optics.
Right. And so that's one of the things that I kind of like about the Yimby neoliberals and just in general, like the neoliberal podcast. And I don't know I know I've had a million arguments with whether it's libertarians or someone from the far left, something to that, arguing to me about what a neoliberal is. I don't care about arguing what a real, air quotes, neoliberal is. All I'm doing is talking about a very specific neoliberal podcast, or I'm talking about a very specific, the Yimby neoliberals, and that is what they are. Is they're pragmatic. They have pragmatic approaches to values that are undoubtedly like left side of the spectrum values.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I mean, so thinking of that, and examining my what I said earlier about taxing vacancy through the lens of don't demonize landlords. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're not saying landlords are bad people. We're saying housing sitting empty while people are homeless is not practical. It's not sustainable. It's not moral. It's bad for everybody except the landlord.
Right.
So how do I say this without demonizing a landlord? I'm sorry, I don't know how.
What if there is, and because obviously people looking for houses aren't evenly distributed throughout the country or throughout an area. So what if someone is looking for a tenant, but they actually just simply can't find one, or the tenants they find are people that are obviously going to trash the place, and not people that you would want as a tenant. That it's not unreasonable to not want them as tenants.
Totally good argument. And for that, I'll ask again. And this is not your fault. I think this is how most people think, which is, what if you end up hurting people who are well-intentioned, or simply they're not bad people, they just have more money than you, right? That's basically what you're asking.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't know if that's necessarily what I'm asking. My point is, say I own a house that I want to rent out, that I am fully committed to renting out at a reasonable price, but the first multiple people that I interview and as potential future tenants, I don't know, I don't know if you do your credit checks or whatever sort of investigation that you do, and you find out pretty quickly that there are people that would probably trash the place, whether they're...
Yeah, let's just say they don't make enough income.
That's because people can make plenty of money and also still trash the place.
But let's just stay with the most legal way, which is they don't make enough income, and they're the only people you interview, right?
Right.
And if you don't rent to them, you're going to be taxed, right? Okay, so the short answer is, at this point, you can decide: wouldn't you rather be taxed than have your place trashed? And your answer should be, depends on how much I'm taxed, right? Yeah, exactly. And so, yes, I'm willing. See, notice I've said this whole time, I didn't say how much a tax should be. I have some idea, like, okay, maybe it should be a tenth of a month's rent, or 1 month's, or half of a month's rent, or so, or something. But my point is, obviously, it can't be taxed to the point where it becomes hurtful to own a property. But even if it is, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, because what would that lead to? It leads to, if you hate being a landlord, sell it, and sell it to somebody who's willing to own it. That would make properties of people who don't want to be landlords anymore on the market, which should, by everything we understand about free market, supply and demand, make housing more available to people who are willing to buy and not willing to rent. So even that's not the worst thing. But yes, in practice, taxing vacancy or taxing anything is for two reasons. One is to raise money. Two is to punish a certain behavior. So taxing vacancy is to punish the behavior of hoarding housing, but also to raise money for what we need for either building affordable housing, which I'm against, because I think there's enough already, and assisting people with all other needs. But the point is, we could do that without hurting the landlord to the point where they feel like they have to make the decision between having their place trashed or being taxed, to which case they could still sell it. But if it's not taxed enough, the criticism is always, well, people will just keep paying the fine and you're not going to solve the problem. And I'm willing to risk that, because even if they just pay the fine, that doesn't hurt them. They don't care. And the house still sits empty. And worse yet, they'll burden it on the next tenant. That's still extra money that we can collect.
Right. So let me make it clear. I'm not arguing against what your proposal. I'm simply saying basically the first potential caveats that come to my mind. And I hate that you're almost going to make me sound like a libertarian or a conservative, but because conservatives think that every person on welfare, or every person that has low income, is practically a low life, or a drug doer, or exactly. And so I'm not saying that or for example, they think that druggies don't deserve help to try to stop drugs. They think that druggies are morally insufficient and they get what's coming to them. And so anyway, but my point, what I'm trying to get at is it would have to be a good balance, because
Absolutely.
Terrible tenants shouldn't be rewarded for being terrible tenants. They shouldn't get to do it no matter what.
I 100% agree with you. And, and not to sound so romanticized, but you take a step back and ask, why are people bad tenants, or why are people bad people? And, yes, I admit this is a little bit naive, but you have to consider, are these people born bad, or are they the result of, bad financial situations, or a long habit of being in the environment that either encourages or forces them to? A little bit, but you don't need to go that far. Just think about, put it this way. Do people really want to be bad if you house them? Or do people even want to be bad if you gave them something better to do that isn't drugs? Or you gave them something more rewarding that isn't crime? This is not saying every person is savable. It's saying that,
right, absolutely.
I believe a lot of people are.
That's most of my speakings on the or my writings on the internet about how Donald Trump voters aren't evil, they're wrong, and while there are a lot of them that can't be saved, a lot of them are just stuck in an echo chamber and haven't had the opportunity to be led away from the cult and all this other sort of things. So, don't get me wrong, I'm fully in favor of recognizing that environment has a huge amount to do with a lot of these problems.
And when I say environment, I mean,
right.
within 5 or 10 years, not in all your life. Yeah.
Sorry, you go ahead.
Oh, no. So what I was saying is that, yes, I agree. There shouldn't, I'll go ahead and say it's not just that trashy troublemakers shouldn't, or bad tenants shouldn't be allowed to destroy people's property. Bad tenants shouldn't exist. People should not be allowed to be bad tenants, just like people shouldn't be allowed to be criminals. Yeah.
Right. So if someone's a terrible tenant, they should be kicked out. They should have to pay the tax that the owner of the property would have otherwise had to pay.
Okay, that's it. But yeah, exactly. Okay, and I think this this sounds very romantic, but
I mean you're talking real romantic to me.
A little bit back to this, which is Yang likes to argue that once we have universal basic income, we can get rid of a lot of our current welfares, and it'll create purchasing power, which would create jobs and so on. What he's really saying, if you put more hands and choices into hands of the poorest people would at least be able to make a choice to do better.
And of course,
rather than forced to do
Andrew
worse,
Yang supports universal health care, and universal health care would include mental health care and drug rehabilitation and things like that. And so just the whole, not even just universal basic income, which would be a huge part of the component, but kind of the whole spectrum of changes Andrew Yang wants to implement, I think would make a huge improvement.
Yeah. And so why am I bringing this up? And I bring this up because I believe a lot of our current, worker protection or tenant protection or disability protection laws are based on the premise that this is our last line of defense. If you don't give the powerless people the benefit of doubt over the landlords and the people who have power, they have nothing, because the system is so rigged in favor of those in government and those with money that you have to basically, stick it to these people in favor of those who need more rights and more accommodations just to equalize it. So my belief is that once you do give people some basic income or some right to housing, then you can in exchange throw down the forceful fist and say, okay, now that I've given you the benefit of doubt and housed you, you can't give me any more excuses. If you destroy property, it's not you lose your deposit. It's you're in prison for vandalism. If you make noise and harass your neighbors, you're dealt with in a criminal way. It's not, well, maybe it's financial stress kind of excuse. Once you give people, I think libertarians like to argue this, is like, if once you give people some power, then the government will take away an excuse for you. I think that's true to a good extent, and I think it should be true to a good extent, which is once we believe people can work from home, then we take away the excuse that they have to leave their home or some type of thinking like that. So if your concern is, what if all we do at the end is give everybody housing, but then vandals will just vandalize with no consequence,
Right.
my answer is then we address that.
Okay. Well, how about we, not to shut you down or anything like that, but how about we talk or move on to maybe another topic? not that anything you're saying is wrong or bad or anything else like that. Just to throw some variety in things. So you mentioned earlier at the very beginning several things that say ODL style, not really libertarians, but kind of right-wing libertarians, whatever you would say. So one of the things that they like to say is that monopolies can't exist without the government. How would you respond to them about that?
It's true, and I mean, I would say it's true, but it ignores context. Monopolies can't exist without government, but nor can property. Monopoly is, I think what they probably meant to say is, monopoly cannot exist without government.
Right, yeah. They think that monopolies only exist whenever, for example, whenever they would give a monopoly to a telegraph company or a railroad or something to that effect. They think that's the only time monopolies come to exist. And of course, depending on who you're talking to, like we were saying earlier, it doesn't literally have to be 100% of the market in order to be a monopoly in practice. If it's 90% of the market, it's still virtually a monopoly.
Exactly, yeah. Or practically, yeah. So monopolies can exist as long as property is protected. That's the short answer. A middle answer would be monopolies exist as long as unfair advantages are protected, such as intellectual property, brand names, or the inherent advantage of simply being rich. And the third answer would be monopolies exist pretty much until you
intellectual property is an unfair advantage, as in, like, if you have an idea, copywriting it is an unfair advantage?
Okay, I'll clarify that. Not per se. It's not that all intellectual property is an unfair advantage, but even in today's world, intellectual property protections expire because we've decided as a society that
they're supposed to accept
protecting something
America extended their intellectual protection laws to the benefit of Disney.
Intellectual property is not a bad idea, but it is something that
eventually
should be balanced with
and
practicality.
Not in some unreasonable amount of time, it should pass into the public domain.
Exactly. And this is back to what I've been saying for a long time, which is that if there's one thing that shouldn't be inherited, that would be it.
I agree with that. Because, for example, in this case, let's stick with Disney. Walt Disney could, patent Mickey Mouse and Steamboat Willie and all that sort of thing, but his kids don't necessarily get to maintain that patent. Right. Okay. Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think it might. Well, I'm not even sure. Just going off the cuff, I might say that maybe there should be say someone invented something 4 years, but then they died within 4 years. Perhaps there should be some amount of time that their children would benefit from it, because 4 years isn't necessarily a long time as far as intellectual property goes. Yeah. But in general, I agree with you.
Yeah, and I'm willing to have the conversation about whether a movie versus a patent versus like a drug
cure for cancer
should have different expiration dates. Exactly, and I think what libertarians really fail on is they are very all or nothing. So you have on one extreme, which is all property is just as long as you have a gun. The other side is all property is just as long as it's physical, and all intellectual property is bad. Those are the two strongest libertarian voices. I've never heard of libertarians say, well, intellectual property is kind of good, or intellectual property is better if we could reform this way, or intellectual property. The only people that say intellectual property is great where it is today are the people that basically say everything with a gun is enforceable.
Yeah, I totally agree. It seems like there's an impossibility for people to have nuance between these ideas, or to think that something is good, but only within a certain context, or it's good to a certain degree.